Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we're talking about the devastating impact of Alzheimer's and dementia and how one son dealt with his father's dementia by circumnavigating Ireland by foot to raise funds for Alzheimer's Research UK. Here to share his journey is Patrick Davies, who you may recall was on the podcast earlier this year to talk about his walk across England from Land's End in Cornwall to John O'Groats in northern Scotland. Hi, Patrick. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
Wow. You've been busy since we talked about your book, Where Skylarks Sing. Can you share where you got the inspiration to walk around Ireland?
Well, when I walked across the UK which is 2021 now, so 3 years ago, and that was when we were sort of just coming out of COVID. There were still restrictions, but we were allowed to move. I got to the end in northeast Scotland and thought, well, I didn't really want it to come to an end. I saw it'd been a long walk. You're tired. Part of me wanted it to end, but part of me, it's just been so wonderful that where would I go next? And Ireland, it's our neighbour. It's so close. It's not a place I knew well at all. I hadn't really spent much time there, been to Dublin, but that's about it. And it just felt the sort of, I don't know, it's part of the British Isles, geographically speaking, so it would complete the British Isles, if you like. So it was always in the back of my mind since 2021. But Ireland is in Northwest Europe. It's on the Atlantic. There's nothing between Ireland and North America. It's renowned for being quite wet and incredibly green. And I always sort of thought maybe I'll go and do something in a bit of nicer weather. And so never got around to Ireland. And then this year I just thought, okay, you've still got that itch. You're still thinking about it. Just go and do it. So that's what I did.
It's funny you mentioned, doing this long walk across England and Scotland and wanting to walk more. And I think people always are surprised, how can you want to do more walking? Like, don't you have enough? It seems very, very repetitive. What for you is the addictive aspect of these long walks?
You're right to use the word addictive. I think they do become addictive, but it's something about the sort of, what walking does for you. And I think people can get this for going for a good walk with their dog in their local community, as well as going on a long distance multi-day hike. So I think people can access the sort of the benefits of walking in short bursts. You don't have to go and walk hundreds of miles. But obviously, when you're doing it repeatedly day after day, I mean, you just sort of, there's something wonderful about having nothing else to worry about, because you've just got to focus on, where are you going to walk? What's your route? Where are you going to stay? And just being sort of absorbed in the countryside, that, all the sort of irritations of everyday life that we all face, just disappear. And that's incredibly therapeutic and as you say, addictive. So I think that's why I wanted to get out and do some more.
And the background of both your last walk and this walk is seeing firsthand the impact of Alzheimer's and dementia, which, again, if you read the newspapers, there's more and more stories about this is a growing kind of health crisis, not just in the UK, but kind of across Western societies. For those who haven't seen dementia or Alzheimer's firsthand, can you maybe describe the impact it has on somebody?
Yeah, I mean, there are different types of dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common. It's quite tricky to diagnose as well, because there isn't a blood test or anything like that at the moment. So people are diagnosed on a range of symptoms, but it typically can, you start to see people having, memory loss, short-term memory loss, not necessarily, old memories, but everyday short-term memory. And that happens to everybody a little bit as they age. But when this starts having a more serious impact on just your ability to function, then clearly it's not just everyday aging. So that's the first sign. And but it can then be that people can become disorientated. People can have difficulty focusing. People have difficulty arranging and just functioning in society in a normal way, to the point where as the disease progresses, people need full-time care. Basically, they can't look after themselves. Without going into too many gory details, I mean, people lose control of parts of their body, and obviously that has an impact. And so it's a really devastating illness. And I think what sort of motivated me to go out and do, well, certainly the first of these long distance walk and then round Ireland raising money for Alzheimer's research, was my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's back in 2017 now. And it was a slow sort of deterioration, but it became clear quite quickly that something wasn't right. And then, since then, you watch it just sort of taking my dad away. I mean, he's still alive. He's in full-time care now. You can't have a conversation with him at all. He's still aware and he still recognizes his close family, but I mean, he can't string a sentence together properly. He can't, as I say, have a conversation, question and answers. He can't look after himself. He has to be, helped all the time. And that's really hard to see. It's, it's your father or mother. They've been an incredible part of your life, and seeing them, and I guess we always look up to our parents. They're the ones that helped us through our formative years and steered us and guided us, and then being incapable of doing any of that, and slowly, as I say, being taken away, even though they're physically alive. It's a weird feeling. There's lots of sort of research into all this about, with people with dementia and Alzheimer's, you're grieving for their passing before they've died, because the disease slowly takes everything away from them. So then they're no longer the person you knew. They're a shell that needs care, and that's really hard. There's no other way to describe it, really. And as I say, what for me motivated me to go and try and raise some money for research was the devastating impact of the disease. But also, I think there's a sense that because it largely affects older people, if you haven't come across dementia or Alzheimer's, it's easy to assume that that's just what happens to some people when they get old. But it isn't aging. It's a disease. It's a disease that slowly destroys the pathways in the brain, so you can't function in a normal way. It's a disease like any other disease. It's a disease that ultimately we should be able to prevent and treat. And when you see that, somebody in their 80s or 90s, fully functioning with a really sharp mind, they may be slower physically because they're older, but they still function normally and they've had a fulfilling long life. And then you look at somebody with dementia, it's awful and terrible what is taken away from people. And if you look at the raw economics of it, it's a massive cost on the economy it's Alzheimer's and dementia, and it is now the biggest killer in most developed countries. Much more so than heart disease, cancer. It is an epidemic, but it's sort of a silent epidemic, because, as I say, it's largely older people who, unless you're affected by it, you won't see so much. But as I say, the costs on that in terms of the care that's needed to be provided, the loss of productive life that people who get the disease have, where they could be self-sufficient and happily enjoying the later years of their lives, that's taken away. So, the costs of this are in their billions and billions of dollars for Western economies, and that's not going to go away until there is better treatment and cure, basically. So.
And reading up for this chat, it seems like there are some positive signs coming out for ways to treat Alzheimer's, and the impact of funding research for this, terrible disease. There's starting to be some hope. Do you follow this enough that, is this something that you see that, hey, there, as kind of just a regular person, you feel like in your lifetime, we might find a way to cure or at least halt the progression of Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I definitely hope so. And as you said, there've been, in the last 2 or 3 years, there've been there's a couple of drugs that in the Europe and North America are now licensed for the treatment of Alzheimer's, which have been shown to slow the progression of the disease in a proportion of people, not everybody. Um, it's quite a complex treatment. My understanding is one of them, it requires infusion, and so it's very regular visits to hospital, and it needs to be very closely monitored because there are side effects and so on. So it's nowhere near a cure. It's nowhere near the treatment that you'd want, but it is the first step. And my hope is that, because obviously some drugs have been found that have had an impact, a positive impact, because at the moment there's nothing. Without those drugs, there is nothing to stop the disease. There are drugs that people with dementia and Alzheimer's are given, but can help mask the symptoms, but it doesn't stop the progression of the disease. So we're getting into that space where we can, and let's hope that over the next few years we can develop on top of what they've found so far, and you can have some really effective treatments that also are cost effective, because these have got to be administered by health services around the world, whether in wealthy nations or not, if it's really going to have an impact on tackling the problem.
So let's move on to the walk you did in Ireland. You did it to raise money for, I think, Alzheimer's Research UK. Thinking back to your walk you did in 2021 from Land's End to John O'Groats, were there anything you learned from that walk that you were going to apply to this walk, whether or not it's, gear or distances or, anything like route selection?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the first thing I learned on the walk across the UK, which I think we talked about in our last chat, was being ruthless about what you take, because it's. I thought when I was about to set up walking across the UK that I had been super ruthless, and I was only taking what I absolutely needed to take. And it became apparent very quickly that my backpack was too heavy. I wasn't going to get very far if I didn't rationalize quite a bit. So obviously, having done the walk across the UK and thinking about and preparing for Ireland, I knew that. So, and I've got my kit, and I bought a couple of new bits and pieces that needed replacing and so on. But there's still a temptation. You think, well, I'll just take that as well, because you think, well, my pack is great now, so I can just add something. And you've really got to say to yourself, no, do not put anything more in, because you've got to carry that all day. So I think that's the first lesson. Second lesson was I had pretty much new boots before I started walking across the UK, which was a very bad idea, because I ended up with hideous blisters, which lasted quite a long time. So this time I made sure I did buy a new pair of boots, because I'd worn the ones out in previous walks, but I made sure that I'd walked in them enough before I started putting them, a backpack on your back and walking serious distances. Didn't escape blisters completely. We can talk about that in a bit and why, but much more so. So yeah, there are things you learn, and route planning. I have one of these mapping apps. There's lots of them, and on a subscription base, you can have the sort of detailed hiking maps of most countries and many countries around the world, and that included Ireland. So, I was able to route plan pretty quickly and effectively, which I'd learned obviously while walking across the UK, because there's no way you can take all the paper maps. You just can't, because there are too many of them, even if you can find them. So you have to rely on technology as well, which also means you have to have a backup, because if you lose battery power and you're using your phone for navigation, then you could be in a bit of trouble. So there's things like that you learn as you go along, basically.
It's actually the one thing I find with using a GPS app is, if it's wet out, your phone does not work correctly, and you get raindrops and it moves you around. And I actually, if I know I'm going to be doing like a wet weather, or kind of where it might be snowing or something, I bring a second phone with the map, because invariably that my screen will get wet, my hands are wet, my coat is wet, my shirt is wet, and it's like I can't dry off the screen. And it's such a weird problem that who would think, your trip can be put in peril just because you can't actually get your screen to show where the heck you are because it keeps, moving around.
Yeah, that was a revelation on my first walk across the UK. I thought, oh, so a raindrop is obviously for the phone's screen. That's the equivalent of somebody touching it with a finger. So it goes crazy. And then, of course, your hands are wet, as you say, and you touch it more, the screen gets even wetter and it doesn't respond. So given how wet it was in Ireland this summer, I developed a little bit of a trick for that. It's still not perfect. So I carried like a microfiber cloth in a plastic bag
Mm.
in my waterproof pocket. I used to carry it with my phone. I've got like a waterproof cover for my phone. I used to carry it with that, but that just gets wet. Then the cloth gets wet and you can't dry your phone. Whereas actually, if you keep that microfiber cloth in a plastic bag so it's not getting wet, when you get your phone out and you need to look at your map, you can wipe it quickly. And if you position yourself so you're not dripping on the phone, it's good enough so you can see it. But it is frustrating. It is frustrating. And I think, some people would say you should be taking paper maps for this very reason. But you just can't if you're going for miles and miles. And maybe many years ago, you could walk into a town and you could pick up the local detailed hiking map because that's what people did. You can't do that now. Even if you can find a shop, it won't have the map because nobody's using them in the same way or in the volume that people did. So you have to rely on technology and come up with little tricks to use it when it's raining. But it becomes quite a frustrating process, as you know. You get your phone out of your pocket, then you're taking it out of its waterproof cover. While you're doing that, it's getting wet. Then I've got to get my dry cloth, dry it down, check where I am quickly enough before it's soaking wet, and then put it back in my pocket. Yeah, it's a bit frustrating, but it works.
So the route you did, there's not just a footpath you can follow all the way around Ireland. You had to piece it together. Can you maybe describe, what walks you pieced together and how you made it all work?
Yeah. So I started and finished in Dublin. And there is Ireland does have quite a few national waymark trails, they're called, long distance pass, several days in various parts of the country. And they have strung several together to get from Dublin to the west coast of Ireland. Dublin's on the east coast, facing the United Kingdom. So to get across to the west coast, you start immediately out leaving Dublin into the Wicklow Mountains. So there's a Wicklow Mountain Way. Then it effectively joins up to something called the South Leinster Way and the East Munster Way and the Blackwater Way, and eventually over to the Beara Way on the Beara Peninsula on the west coast. So that sort of joins together quite nicely, and indeed is part of one of the European long distance pass this one's called the E8, that you could start in the west of Ireland and end up in Istanbul. Actually, it is linking together national pass in different countries. So that bit was relatively straightforward because I could find GPX files of each of the long distance paths and sort of string them together. I should say that Ireland doesn't have the same sort of network of footpaths as you do in the UK and in many other parts of mainland Europe. They don't have the same rights of way access. So most often you're walking on forest tracks or small lanes, back roads and things like that. It's very, very rare that you're actually on a footpath or crossing a field. It just isn't the way it's done in Ireland, which when I said before I still got blisters this year, I think it was quite basically because of the amount of tarmac or even your forest tracks can be sort of compacted gravel and stuff like that. So it can be quite hard on the feet. But you get used to it like everything else. So to get from Dublin to the west coast, I could string together a series of national waymark trails. Then when you get to the west coast, there are three peninsulas. There's the Beara Peninsula, the Kerry Peninsula, and the Dingle Peninsula. They're also like fingers at the bottom of the southwest of Ireland. Each one of those has a week-long, 10-day-long trail that goes around them, and so I could add those onto the path, my own route. Then it got more tricky going up the west coast. There are little parts where there are long distance paths that, but in between them, you've just got to link up back roads and tracks to get to your next multi-day path, if you like. And those multi-day paths, the National Waymark Trails, are really well marked, which is really helpful. But in between them, I just had to come up with my own route, basically. And the more you did it, the better I got at looking at the map and thinking, that's going to be a quiet back road, because some quiet back roads, we call them rat runs over here. It's, people use them as a little cut through, thinking I need to get from main road here to main road there. And it's the perfect line for somebody to cut out a busy section of town or whatever. So you got quite good at looking at that and thinking, no, I won't do that one. I'll take another route that looks like it'll be much quieter. So that's how I did it, basically, with one of those mapping apps. And when there wasn't a long distance path, you just gotta find your way until you can join the next one, basically.
With those country lanes, I know when I used to live in the UK and go cycling, on these little tiny country lanes, some of them were incredibly dangerous because you had these huge hedgerows on either side. It was curving, and guys in their sports cars, it'd be a fun drive, but they're not expecting necessarily, some Canadian out there cycling on a Saturday morning, and they'd just be flying. Is it the same? I even less expect a walker, I assume. So was that something you had to be aware of like, guys racing around in their cars and, not having very much visibility?
Yes, to a degree. On going all on the west coast of Ireland, Ireland is pretty sparsely populated compared to many countries. Even now, I mean, the population has been growing, but and Ireland is increasing. It's doing very well for itself, but it's not a densely populated place. So those lanes are not as busy as on mainland UK. Certainly not on the west coast. As I got closer to Dublin on towards the end of the walk down the east coast, that's the sort of most densely populated part of the whole island. That was, sometimes I thought I'd picked a really quiet back road and it's really busy. It's like, no, that was not good. But most of the time they're extremely quiet. But you do have to have your wits about you, always walking, facing the oncoming traffic. I did have a few moments where I was waving my walking poles just to make sure somebody had seen me. But most of the time, actually, people aren't rushing in rural communities in west of Ireland usually, and it's quite quiet. So, in fact, more often somebody would drive past and they would stop and they'd wind down the window going, wait, what are you doing? Well, they wanted, they didn't see walkers, so they wanted to have a chat. So that was quite nice.
So for people who, can't walk the entire, circumnavigation of Ireland, what are some highlights that, people want to go for a walking tour in Ireland? What were some of the places that really, impacted you?
So right at the beginning, as you leave Dublin, it's very convenient. The Wicklow Mountains are beautiful. You gain, not Rocky level elevation clearly, but you gain elevation pretty quickly coming out of the south of Dublin. And there's a several day hike across those mountains. That was lovely. And there's lots of, you're in the mountains, but there's also your lakes and there's some quite religious pilgrimage sites as well, which are beautiful. So that was lovely. The west coast, as it were, they mentioned the peninsulas, the Beara, the Kerry, and the Dingle peninsulas, all right next to each other. Kerry is the biggest and probably the best known, and there's something called the Ring of Kerry, which is a driving route. So it's busy with camper vans and bus tours and whatever. There's a long distance trail around there, but the Beara Peninsula, the most southern one, is just, it's stunning. It's beautiful. Really sort of rugged coastal scenery. There's lots of islands off the coast. So the views are great when the weather's nice. and there's little towns or villages that you can stay in each night, as well as campsites some of the way too. Dingles again. I would say between the two, it's quite popular, but not as much as the Kerry Peninsula. That again has a walk all the way around it, which is lovely. There's lots. There's a place called the Burren further up the west coast, which is this. It's limestone karst, they call it. It's like platforms of rugged limestone that, of course, there's fields around them and people are farming them, but it's just these vast flat areas of rugged limestone. It's amazing to see. That's beautiful. Then when you get into the north, the Causeway Coast, that does have a long distance footpath, and it's a proper footpath along the coast. The Giant's Causeway is a geological phenomenon where it's volcanic basalt that cooled in a certain way that it produced incredibly sort of well-defined hexagons of rock in pinnacles, and then that sort of it's called a causeway. It's like a footpath going out into the sea with these hexagonal rocks all interlinked. But the whole of the cliffs along there are all made of this basalt hexagons. It's beautiful, and there is a footpath of several days along there as well. So there's loads. I mean, it's a beautiful place, and being on foot, I couldn't get to all of it by any stretch of the imagination because there isn't a coastal road. The coast is incredibly intricate and wiggly, so it would have taken years and years to go down every peninsula, and you'd have to come back up again on the road because there aren't coastal footpaths. But so I only saw a fraction of it, even walking around the whole country, if that makes sense.
Let's talk a little bit about where you stayed each night, because you mentioned campsites, you mentioned little villages at some parts. What's it like compared to, other big walks where you kind of have a village typically, every 4 or 5 hours? Is that the case in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, you'll find villages certainly at the end of every day if you want to. They don't have the camping infrastructure certainly not the UK or many parts of mainland Europe. So, I mean, when I walked across the UK, I did little bits of wild camping, but I camped for 60 something out of 73 nights, and they're just on little campsites. I mean, they're not big resorty campsites; they're tiny. They're farms or whatever, but that doesn't exist in the same way in Ireland. So I did some wild camping. I did do camping on campsites where they existed. I camped in a park. I mean, I asked permission, but I camped in a park. I camped one place on the west coast there's a fjord, one of Ireland's few fjords, a lovely place, very scenic. And I walked into this village and I hadn't been able to find anywhere to stay in advance. And I asked in the pub, and they went, "Well, I think somebody at the hotel they'll let you camp in the garden as long as you go and buy a drink." So I camped in this very nice hotel garden, which seemed to me to be really bizarre, and they were very happy. And I did go in and have a drink and ate some food. And so all these people in this not uber luxury hotel, but certainly a decent mid-range hotel were paying for their rooms, and I was in the garden across the road with the best view of the field. But I stayed in rooms above pubs. I stayed in hostels. I stayed in. I mean, the people were just so wonderfully friendly. I stayed with friends of friends of friends who found out I was walking, and they said, "Well, you must come and stay with us." And so it was a mix of things, really.
And then Ireland is famous for, rainy weather. But I know that's not always the case. England's famous for rain, but in summer it's usually glorious and dry. And what's it like in Ireland? Was it really rainy?
So Northern Europe had a particularly bad summer this year. Most of Northern Europe, while it was quite hot and people are having heat waves in the south of Europe, in the north it was pretty. I mean, this is climate change. we evaporate more water and it hits Northern Europe, so it's wetter, basically. So it was a particularly wet summer. Parts of the west of Ireland were having 2 or 3 times their normal rainfall, and they have quite a lot normally. So again, what is amazing doing these long distance walks, you learn as you go along. So I had a mindset. I'm from the north of the UK, north of England, which is known for being, a bit wet compared to the southern parts of the UK. So I thought I knew a bit about rain and walking. But in Ireland, you're walking, and because there's nothing. When you're on the west coast, you've just got the Atlantic between you and North America, so there's nothing to stop the weather, and so it can be quite windy as well, not surprisingly. So when the weather changes, it changes in an instant, and so I'd be thinking, oh, it looks like it's getting a bit cloudy, and it might rain in a bit, and like 5 minutes later, you can be drenched like you're in a power shower, because the wind has blown the weather in, it's dumped its water, and off it goes. It's so if you when you start to feel that dampness in the air and you think the clouds are getting dark, it's like, put your waterproofs on now. Because you're going to get extremely wet if you don't. So you sort of learn that as you go along. But it also meant that if you're in that sort of weather that's blowing in and out really quickly, actually sometimes I didn't put my waterproofs on because it was mild, because it's the summer, that actually the wind is going to blow you dry quite quickly after you've got wet. So it's those days that didn't look like it would get a bit drier in between that you definitely have to have your waterproofs on. So yeah, I wore a lot of waterproof trousers and coat days. I was in Donegal, which is the northwest of Ireland, and I'd had a couple of days rest off in Donegal town and was heading into the hills, and it had been horrible weather over the weekend. It's part of the reason I stopped. It had been just torrential rain, and it was like drizzle. It was not very nice. And as I was walking up into the hills, this small little van stopped beside me, and guys wound down the window asking what I was doing, where I was going. And he said, "Oh, it's just horribly wet. Don't take the high route in the hills. There's a lower route that's better in the conditions." And I said to him, "Well, yeah, that was my plan, but don't worry about me. I know quite a lot about rain because I'm from Northern England." And he went silent and looked at me and said, "You know nothing," because he's like, "This is Donegal. You do not know rain until you've been in Donegal." And he was sort of right, but it's still beautiful, because it's not. When it rains, it's not raining all the time. You did have grey days, but it blows in and out quite quickly. So it's a stunningly beautiful place and incredibly green. It's called the Emerald Isle for a very good reason, and it gets a lot of rain. So, I think Britain is green, but go to Ireland, it's almost like an unnatural colour. It's so vivid. It's incredible. So yeah, it's lovely to see.
Lots of people, this is the time of year when they start planning their summer walk, and there are people listening that are thinking of doing their first big walk. Having done a lot of, long distance walks yourself, do you have any advice for someone who's thinking of doing a big walk 6-9 months from now?
Yeah. Just do it would be my advice. I've now done a few long distance walks, but before I walked across the UK in 2021, I hadn't. I'd always enjoyed walking, like, going out for a day and having a good walk, or going out into the hills or whatever. But I'd never done anything multi-day long distance. And I think you get people stopping you all the time and people say, "Oh, I couldn't do that." "Oh, no, I couldn't do that. That sounds, it's something, unachievable." It's a walk. So, what I'm doing is I'm not sort of, I don't know, I'm not running across a desert. I'm not running up a mountain. I'm walking. And yes, I'm carrying a backpack, but it's incredible what your body will do if you ask it to. And as I say, make sure you're ruthless in your packing so you're not carrying too much. Or if the first time you want to do a multi-day walk, do one where you're walking from place to place where you're going to stay, and maybe get somebody for the first time you do it. There's all sorts of companies that will take your bag from location to location. So you can just carry what you need for the day as you get used to it. But, with walking, I'm a relatively fit person, but I'm not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination. But with walking, you get fit as you go along. So early on, you might not walk as far, and it may take you a bit longer. But once you've been walking for a few days, you will find naturally that you start walking longer because you're fitter and your body is ready to do it, and so on. So, I don't plan very many days in advance, because I'll have an outline of a route and know where I know where my beginning and end point is for the whole walk. But on each day, I don't plan many ahead, because you don't know what the weather's going to be like. You don't know how you're going to be feeling. You don't know, so you can then adjust and say, well, actually, tomorrow is not particularly hilly. I'm feeling good. I can walk 25 miles, or I can walk 10 miles, because actually I've had a few big days in the hills or mountains, and therefore I'll have a shorter day. Oh, and actually, 7 or 8 miles away, there's a nice little town that I can, if I get there early afternoon, I can have a bit of a break and enjoy the town. So I that's how I work. I would hate personally to have everything rigidly set out and know that you've got to walk whatever you decided before you left home. You've got to walk what you've determined. So, I've always found you can always find places to stay and be quite flexible. But if you've got, clearly, if you've just got a few days away from work and you need to fix, I would err on the side of doing less than more, because then you'll have time to look around in places. And also, if you do find the walking for the first couple of days a bit tough, you haven't set yourself a crazy target that then's going to feel, tough to do. It's better to have that, give yourself some flexibility, I guess, early on. But yeah, as I say, just go and do it. It's a wonderful experience. You'll meet, particularly if you choose one of the known walks, like on the west coast of Ireland, you'll meet other people on the way. You'll probably end up staying in somewhere with other walkers from all over the world. It's great to meet people and share your stories and so on. So, just go do it.
I wish I'd had this advice a couple months ago, because my wife and I just did a big walk, or not a big walk, but a 2.5-week walk. And we tried to fit the route into the number of days we had. And it was just, some days were a sufferfest, and we couldn't kind of just enjoy, because we got in our heads. We had to get from here to there. And in the end, we said, why don't we just go slower and come back and do, the last week at another time? But sometimes you just say, okay, I'm going to cram it all in. And then days become 33, 35 kilometers, where you kind of wake up and walk and lunch and walk, and then, you can't enjoy it. And we had a couple of nice days that weren't as long, but yeah, we made the mistake of trying to do too much, which, was too bad.
Yeah. And it, don't get me wrong, I find it quite tough to be disciplined too, because I had a sort of fixed end date this year where I really had to be back. And when you're walking around the whole Isle of Ireland, it was over 2,000 kilometers. You don't really quite know how long it's going to take. So I had a rough guess. Not guess. I worked out roughly how long I thought it was going to take. But then you do need rest days. Every week or 10 days, I would take a day off just to not walk just continually. And so you need to factor that in. And so because I had a hard end date, I did sort of probably walk further than I necessarily would have chosen to do some days, because you just think, I've got to get there. And when the closer you get to the end, it's very easy to work out, and you think, I ended up with the last days being quite short because I'd done so much early on, because it was like, I really do have to finish, so I've got to keep going. So, I'm not brilliant at it, but that's my advice to other people, having not been great at this myself, is don't overdo it. Slow down. I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people I know I've got this to walk today, and I'd much rather get up early and do it and finish, and then not least because I'm planning the next day's walk. You want a bit of downtime. Because I was raising money for Alzheimer's research, I'm curating photos every day and I'm posting them on Instagram and Facebook, which takes time. So, I'm much more a get it done sort of person. Whereas I wish I was like just sit down in this place with a beautiful view for half an hour and let you just enjoy it. Whereas I get on with it. So yeah. Just go and do it, but enjoy it, and don't push yourself too hard. I would say, just because you need the time to absorb what you're seeing and enjoy the places you get to visit.
And that's a great way to end this. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing this new journey you just did, Patrick. It's been a pleasure hearing more about this walk and talking a little bit about the impact of Alzheimer's. If people want to see photos of your walk or maybe donate to Alzheimer's Research UK, where can they find that information?
Well, they'll find me on Instagram, Patrick J Davies, and on Facebook as well. And there are links on there, and that they'll find through the fundraiser and find also to that book you mentioned, where Skylark Sing, the book about the walk across the UK, which came out at the end of last year. So so they'll find all those links on my Instagram.
And that book is a great book, if you're looking for a Christmas gift for someone that likes travel or is interested in the outdoors or just wants to read an interesting story and journey. I highly recommend that book. I'll put links for all of this in the show notes. And with that, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.